So we're very privileged to be joined by Professor Graham Towl. Graham became the chair of the Scottish Advisory Panel on Offending Rehabilitation in 2023, and this panel is supported by the Scottish Government, giving advice to the development of rehabilitation programmes in prison and the community, and they also accredit structured, large group-based interventions. He was an expert member of the Ministerial Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in State Custody, which would include hospitals and prisons. He's also a member of the Harris Review into the suicides among 18 to 24-year-olds in prison. Graham was a former head of psychological services for England and Wales, where he grew the staffing from 400 to over 1,000 in a 5-year period. And he went on to be the chief psychologist at the Ministry of Justice. He's now Professor of Psychology at Durham University. He has numerous research interests, including prisoner suicide, mental health, sexual assaults on university campuses, hate crimes, and crime generally. He, as you all know, will have had several hundred publications to his name, including books, book chapters, journal papers, blogs, and published in psychological and higher education media. He was peer ranked by the BPS as the most influential forensic psychologist in the UK, and is one of the comparatively few psychologists listed in Who's Who. Now, uniquely, he's received the BPS Award for Distinguished Contributions to Professional Practice and also the DFP Award for Contributions to Research. He's a co-editor with David Crichton of Forensic Psychology, a BPS-approved textbook of psychology for advanced undergraduates and postgraduate students, and he's a series editor of books on new directions in forensic psychology. Graham was a founding chair of the British Psychological Society's Division of Forensic Psychology and the final chair of what was then called before the former Criminological and Legal Psychology. Yeah, that's what it was when I first joined. He was a council member of the Health and Care Professions Council, chairing registration appeals and the remuneration committee. So apart from that, you've got a lot of time on your hands, Graham. So we're very lucky to have you. I'm looking forward to hearing about your work.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me along. I do appreciate it. It's really good to be here. So thank you very much.
Graham, we start all our episodes with asking our guests about how they got into the field. So please could you tell us how you came to work in forensic psychology?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was studying psychology at Durham, funnily enough, all those years ago. And I came across some information at the careers department on roles in prisons, and I made a few inquiries about it. And at the time, we didn't use the term forensic psychology; the term prison psychology was used, and it was far less popular. And so when I applied, I was delighted to get an interview, and there was some sort of assessment centre, I recall, and I got the post. And as I say, there weren't huge numbers of applicants. I'm not sure I get in these days, and where there's huge numbers of applicants, but certainly in those days there weren't huge numbers of applicants. It wasn't really seen. It wasn't seen as say like clinical psychology, which was more described by its function, with the term clinical, whereas we weren't seen as forensic, where we were described as function. It was just prison. We were described by place
where you worked, yeah.
And that was it. So it was just, oh, you're a prison psychologist, and that was that. And at the time, there was an MSc in applied criminological psychology at Birkbeck College in London, and I thought it was quite a good deal because I was getting paid for learning on the job, as it were. But in the prison, I started in High Point Prison in Suffolk, and the Home Office paid for the MSc, which we did part time over 2 years. So I thought that was quite an agreeable arrangement at the time.
So what are the main sort of changes you've seen in your time in the profession?
Other than the name, of course.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Well, yes, that's right. I mean, there was the change in name from Division of Criminological and Legal Psychology, which was always a bit of a mouthful for everyone, to Division of Forensic Psychology. I mean, part of the reason for that change was there was the advent of chartership at the time, and it would have been quite a mouthful to be a chartered criminological and legal psychologist rather than the chartered forensic. The term forensic was getting increasing currency, so that's one of the reasons why there was a change. And also the terms criminological and legal started increasingly to be used interchangeably with the term forensic, and forensic was seen as a catch-all across the two. I think I mean, there was a vote of DFP or DCLP members as it was there, and I think it was about 88% of people voted for the change in favour of it. So even those 12% who didn't vote in favour of it, felt there was a legitimacy to it. In the sense that, if I was part of the 12% and 88% of people had voted in the other direction, I'd say, well, at least I can't complain about that in terms of the legitimacy of it in that way. So it was a shift, but not everyone was totally persuaded by it. But now, of course, it's as if we've always said forensic, and such is the passage of time. But I mean, that was about 30 years ago, so I get that. So that's been a change. There's been the name changes, and then of course there was regulation, statutory regulation by the Healthcare Professions Council. That was earlier this century. Was that around 2006? I think. So that was a big change with statutory regulation. And of course, the growth in the number of psychological posts. So, for example, when I started, there were probably just under 200. By the time I became head of psychological services, about 12 years later, there were nearer to 400 staff. And then, as you pointed out, Geraldine, in my 5 years, I expanded the staff from 400 to just over 1,000. So, there's been a tremendous growth in terms of forensic psychology, and also not just within prisons, although I understand that the prison service will probably be the largest single employer of forensic psychologists, but the numbers of people who now are numbers of employers of forensic psychologists are much wider than they once were, and there's all sorts of opportunities now. So for example, with health services that provide psychological services, in-reach services in prisons, where some people will move over into health in that way. And other areas too. I mean, there's some variability, and that it's an interesting area. There's some variability in the openness of posts to people from a range of backgrounds. And so, I mean, sometimes posts become more open because people struggle to recruit the precise person of the precise background they like, and then they think, well, okay. We'll go for someone maybe a little bit different or from a slightly different discipline. But I think the thing to remember with the well, there was a development of the occupational standards in just at the end of the last century. I'm feeling old when I say that, but the occupational standards document indicated that practitioner psychologists from whatever area have over 80% in common in terms of skill set and core knowledge and so on. So it's not surprising that employers or some employers have thought, well, I know, at least I'll get someone who's qualified and accountable. And if they need a bit of top-up training, so be it. We'll support them that way. And that would then be captured under sort of continuing professional development or something. So I think that's been an interesting development. And that's and then the advent then of the specialist titles, the shifts in terms of training, which I think is a mixed bag. So I think those are some of the changes, and I think we've also seen over time in prisons, compared to when I started, there was quite a narrowing of the role of psychologists, particularly down the sort of program side. That was quite a narrowing role, and then that was always going to provide a tension with people's training needs. Whether or not they could get the breadth, as it were, of training they needed, whilst, as it were, institutionally there were the demands to, deliver a particular program or whatever. So that's been an interesting dynamic. Yeah.
That sort of started. You did sort of road shows and talked to people about it, and were saying that trainees should be able to move between different places to get the breadth of experience that they needed. And I don't know in practice whether that really took off enough that people did get chance to work in a different setting, whereas the doctorate students have to do all the different settings. I think, the trainees, for instance, who were in prison probably didn't have that same opportunity to go across the different settings that forensic psychologists work, so hospitals, the community, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, my own view at the time when there was the start of the changes to the training of psychologists was that we shouldn't have had two exemplars for each core role, because to my mind, an exemplar is just that. And so it seems to me that if we accept the four core roles on face value, I don't see why we would have more than one of them. It doesn't make sense to me. It's an exemplar. So if someone's met the standard, that's sufficient. I don't need them to do it a second time. I wouldn't ask someone to repeat a medical degree. If they did 5 years and say, well, now you've demonstrated everything once, now demonstrate it all again. And my thought at the time was that would lead to quite long periods of time for people to get that training, because they'd simply have to double everything up. And I never saw the logic of that. I was never persuaded by that. And it seemed to me that there were some inevitable consequences. And again, it's one of the regrets I have, that I think we probably lost a number of people because of those, those demands and so on. And as I say, that tension between sometimes what the employer wanted and what the trainee needed. But we could have, as a profession, we could have addressed some of that ourselves by simply saying, well, just have one exemplar for X rather than having two. So with us maintaining the quality, so I would stress it's not cutting back in quality. But it's, and if you look at the documentation from the HCPC and you look at which is derived from the legislation, it is a threshold qualification. Well, if it is a threshold qualification, once you reach the threshold, you've reached the threshold. So why have to reach the threshold twice? So that's always been a conundrum for me. And I my own take on it. I mean, others may take a different view, but my own take on it, that was probably an error, to have that. I understand now that's changing with the research core role, where it's just now been one exemplar, I think, for that. But I'm not sure about the others, because there's, what is it, training, consultancy, and then assessment and interventions.
It changed the year after I submitted, so I'm harbouring some feelings around that, but we can do that for another time. Okay, so we've talked about some of the changes that you've seen working on forensic psychology. What about the changes that you would like to see in the future?
Well, there's a change I've just suggested that I would like to see, because I think I think we'd have more people qualifying. I think we won't have compromised quality by definition. It's a threshold qualification. I think at a stroke we would improve the offer, as it were, for employees of different organisations who are on training routes to being forensic psychologists. And I think at a stroke we would also improve the offer to the recipients of our services, in a sense they would have more chance of accessing a qualified psychologist, in a sense. Because, I mean, being qualified isn't just about competence, important though that is, it's also about accountability. And I think that's the other side, the other side to it. Once someone is registered in that way, well, then they're individually accountable in that way. So it makes a lot of sense for organisations to have more qualified staff, and I think there's a big market for it. So that would be, that would be my thought. One of my thoughts would be a change I would personally like to see, because I think it would do a lot of good, and it's difficult for me to see what harms it would do. Because as I say, there's no reduction in standard. The threshold's kept the same. I guess some people might argue, oh well, we've only tested it once. We don't absolutely know, so shouldn't we test it again? But you could go on saying that forever. You could go and I would stress, if we look at the requirements of the HCPC, it's a threshold qualification, and it's the same for other health and social care professions. They're threshold qualifications. We're not expecting everyone to be able to do everything when they're qualified. What we are expecting is someone to work within their boundaries, to work within their expertise. And if someone is new and they're newly qualified, then I wouldn't expect that person to be doing the work that someone who'd been qualified for 10 years was doing. But I would expect them to be accountable and be professional and understand what to do and what not to do, and to go for assistance when they wanted it or needed it. I've always had a broad church approach to these sorts of things. There's many different routes and pathways for each of us. But I guess I've had a lifelong commitment to sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And what I'm conscious of is the more we restrict the ways in which you can become a psychologist, the more we exclude people. And that's for me what troubles me about that some of the time. And I mean, I think I contributed on some social media recently about this, about looking at the costs of courses going up and up and up. And a function of that is we will exclude people. I mean, there'll be some people will not be able to even consider being a psychologist, forensic psychologist, and I think that's a shame. That my view is that's a shame. I understand why people make those charges and so on. They're working within a bigger system and structure and so on, but some of that is of our own making, and that's a bit about choices. So, so for example, I mentioned about saying one exemplar for a core role. I'm really genuinely chilled about that. But that in price terms, I mean that makes a lot of difference for people, because they would become qualified more quickly, and then they will get qualified salaries more quickly. So these things make a real practical difference to people on the ground, both in terms of staff and also, as I mentioned before, in terms of recipients of services. So I think we do need to think about those sorts of things. I think those would be some of the sorts of changes that I would like to see. Yeah, that's my answer to that question.
And how have you because you've got a very broad range of research interests as well. I mean, how have they all developed? Have they been areas of work that you're interested in, or have they collaborations, or?
Well, suicide was always a thing that was close to my heart when I was in prisons, because the rates were pretty high. And I didn't feel that as psychologists we were getting involved enough at the time. As I said, we're getting very involved in programs and reducing risk of reoffending, but it seemed to me we weren't reducing risk of suicide. And that seemed to me, it's almost, to my mind, what could be more important than that? I mean, it's about someone's life. And the rates were going up. And so that exercised me. And I was very fortunate in being able to work as a practitioner in a prison, working with people who are suicidal, but also I was quite early on in my career. I was asked to join various policy groups on suicide, and I chaired a group which brought together researchers from the academic community and practitioners and so on about how we might develop our suicide prevention policies and so on. And then I started writing a few books on the subject then, getting far more interested in it. But I'm very upfront about my motivations and what moves me, things like equity, diversity, inclusion, and so on. And that's why I get troubled by some of those routes into psychology sometimes, because I can see, in terms of that earlier question of yours about what's changed, I think we've become a far more exclusive profession than we used to be. So when I started, you didn't have to have an MSc. You just come in as an undergraduate, and it was funded for you. I mean, that's far more open in terms of inclusion, far more open. Of course, things have developed since then, and so there's been a proliferation of the MSCs in forensic psychology, and I understand all that. We're in different times now, but it does seem to me that it's worth just taking stock occasionally and thinking, well, what are the implications of this for us?
You've worked in various forensic settings. Is there anywhere that you haven't yet conquered and you're going to work next, or somewhere that you particularly enjoyed and you're going to go back to?
Well, I've always felt very fortunate being able to, I felt fortunate when people would look at me with concern, actually, when I said I was going to go and work in a prison. Some of my friends at the time said, "Are you sure, Graham? Are you sure you want to go in there?" And I mean, now it has become more fashionable and more normative for people to go and work in prisons. I think it's partly a volume thing in terms of numbers and so on, and changing times. So I've enjoyed that. I mean, I've worked in mental health hospitals, facilities. I've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed working, across prisons and probation. I've enjoyed. I mean, I've liked it all in different sorts of ways, but I've been very fortunate in the sense that I spent more or less half my career in practice and more or less half of it in the academic world, which has, for me, felt a nice mix. But I am very conscious that I just happened to be in the right place at the right time to be able to make that switch when I did. So if I'd been in a different place at a different time, that opportunity wouldn't necessarily have been available to me. So if you look now in the academic world, there are far more professors of forensic psychology posts now than there ever were, say, 20 years ago. I mean, there's been a real proliferation. And part of that is with the proliferation of the MSCs in forensic psychology. But it's broader than that. I mean, that's just part of it. So if now someone was looking to move to the academic world from practice, I think it would be more straightforward. At the time, it felt like once in a lifetime opportunity. So I thought, oh, I'll grab that. Not many of those come along, so I'll grab that. I'll take that. And also, I'm from the north originally, and it being the north appealed to me, and I was a bit. I was a bit tired of commuting into central London. Joyous though the role was and so on, there is something about the everyday commuterness which just did not suit me. I'm more of a country bumpkin. I'm not really a city person in that way, and so for me it was always a bit full and so on. So I just wanted to have a bit more freedom. So here I walk into work and and I enjoy that aspects to it, and I think I'm very lucky to be able to do that. And I don't have the sort of cut and thrust of working in a prison and so on. I'm glad I did, and I'm glad I had that, and that's helped shape me as I am now. And it's helped me have a respect and time for colleagues who are in those sorts of roles, because I do have some awareness of those demands. That's not to say that, I think things are more difficult now than they were when I was working as a practitioner. I think we've had the advent of COVID, we've had all these big things happen. And if you look at the prisoner population, that's changing. It's becoming a more difficult and challenging prisoner population from what I see from the outside. I mean, as I say, I would defer to colleagues who are in the thick of it, as it were, on this. But it seems to me that we're getting different types of prisoners. There's different. The profile of prisoners is starting to change. So we've got fewer younger people. We've got more, say, males over 50. Those sorts of things. There are. And of course there's terrorist prisoners too. So there's quite a lot that's going on, which I think is problematic, and that against the backdrop of a policy of austerity where money has been systematically taken out of public services, and in particular the prison service in this case, and that makes things more difficult. And with a historically high staff turnover rate too, and that churn rate amongst prison officers and so on, that all provides a very challenging operating environment. I think. I mean, again, without wishing to sound like an old codger, when I started, staff turnover was virtually unheard of. I mean, there was very few people leaving. It was quite a big. The main reason for people leaving, as I recall, it was retirement parties. Well, that's very different, isn't it? Whereas now that's changed differently. That's not to say that that there aren't good new and young staff. I think there are, but you can't bottle experience in that way. It takes some time to develop that experience, and I think there has been some losses to the organisation that way, and that's the backdrop against which a lot of psychologists in prisons are working against. So that's very challenging. None of us are an island, so we do work in that. That wider environment. As I said, then there's the whole managerialist culture. Now, I think the managerialist culture played well for programs, because it was things like making programs KPIs, as they were called at the time, key performance indicators, and so on. And a lot of people celebrated that. But it did mean that the psychology discipline was quite beholden to that in terms of what is a very big area of work. So that there are pros and cons to that.
And so you've also more recently done research on sexual assaults on campus. And again, this recent, I say recent, I can't think how many years it was, the last few years anyway. But before that, again, that doesn't seem to be an area of research. And now it seems a big area of research. So has something changed that it's happening more? Or has it just been reported more?
Right. But I think that there is a problem in the academic world. And the regulator, the Office for Students, is looking at this to whether or not they should do more regulation on it. And I have been fortunate in being able to do some of the research on some of that in terms of what universities have and haven't done. But my background on that was I was a member of the executive team, because I got the job it's called Pro Vice Chancellor. So basically, I'm like a member of the board or the senior team. So I did a 5.5-year stint on that. And they said they wanted someone to lead a sexual violence task force. And I think when they heard about my background, they said, "Oh, we've got just the guy." It felt like a hot potato at the time, and not everyone was chomping at the bit to do it. So I was happy to do it, but I recognised it would be a difficult one for all sorts of reasons, because it was basically. I knew once I started looking into it, it would be worse than we thought it was, most likely. The crime survey for England and Wales data and discovered that the students, particularly young women students, are of all occupational groups at the highest risk. Of course, the corollary of that is that some of the most predatory individuals are male students. And that's quite interesting. That's quite an uncomfortable thing. That's quite an uncomfortable thing to discuss with people, because in a sense, a lot of the literature on sex offenders tends to be derived from prison populations or offender populations and so on. But of course, people will get imprisoned and be part of the criminal justice process at differential rates depending on where they sit in society. We know that. And so the problem in universities is very significant indeed. And I mean at Durham, for example, we are in treble figures in terms of the numbers of reports we have each year. We have some of the highest reports, of that in the country. I mean, there are others with very high levels of reports too. But I think, I mean, you alluded to this. I think we're right to distinguish between reporting rates and prevalence rates. I don't think we necessarily have higher prevalence rates. And so I would rather we had higher reporting rates if there's a high prevalence, because I think the reasons for that are twofold. One is we can provide people with support, whether it's educational support, education adjustment, and we're quite good at that, when there's mitigating circumstances and so on, for a whole range of reasons. And then counselling support and so on. And then for those who want it, then we can do an investigation into such cases. And I think that's very important. But look, when I did the evaluation work with colleagues, colleagues from Sums Consulting who did this work for the Office of Students, there is a very mixed picture in universities about the extent to which all universities will say we take this very seriously. But it's a pretty vacuous statement if people cannot back that up with how much they're investing in the area, how many staff they have to address the area, what they're actually doing, what actions they've taken against people where they have been found to, on the balance of probability, be most likely to have. But again, I hear of some students who have been reported for acts of sexual misconduct. I hear that they want to get very lawyered up in situations and so on, and then and it can be very difficult. So I guess this is an area where it brings together my experience from education and higher education, and also my background from a sort of forensic perspective in that sort of way. So I mean, it used to be that, for example, if something happened or someone said that reported something had happened to them, just any academic more or less would be picked to go and investigate it, not with any knowledge of the area at all. Whereas now we do have trained investigators. Well, at Durham we have trained investigators. A number of institutions have trained investigators, but not all. And it's a very mixed picture. So I think there may be regulations. So just as we regulate around widening participation, it's like, as a member of staff, I would not have a sexual relationship with one of my students. It just seems to me to be a clear boundary issue that not to do that. But that's not necessarily a view shared with everyone. Shared by everyone. Some people will argue, well, look, everyone's 18, they're all, consenting adults and so on, calmly putting aside any power differential. And I think the two proposals that have been discussed are, one is an outright ban, and the other is a declaration. So if there is a relationship which starts up, people got to declare it, so it's on a register within the institution. And of course, as you can imagine with these sorts, I mean, I think it's fairly straightforward. You just ask people to focus on their research and their education, the teaching. It's hard. Stick to your job description. You call me old-fashioned, but I really do think it's fairly straightforward. Just don't find yourself having sex with your students. Tell you what, why not just do some classes, teach, and do some research? I don't think it's a big ask, given if you look at the nature of the employment contract. It seems to me to fulfill it in that way. So for me, it strikes me still as a bit extraordinary, I must admit, that I'm almost even having the conversation. But of course, it's an area, of course, where there's lots of whataboutery. People say things like, well, imagine if a couple come to the university and one of them is a postgraduate student and one of them is a member of staff, then what do you do and so on? I think with all the whataboutery, like with other areas of whataboutery in life, one can look at individual cases in particular ways. But the normative assumption seems to me to be, don't have sex with your students. Just like I'd say to psychologists working in prisons, don't have sex with prisoners. It's just like, do you almost have to say it? I just find it extraordinary, but there again, that's maybe my naivety showing through.
I remember I used to help run the training for SOTP, and we were told we had to tell people that. And I said, why do we have to tell people? I thought that would be common sense. And there'd been cases obviously where it happened, and they'd said we weren't told we shouldn't do it. So we just told people they shouldn't do it. You would have thought it would be common sense that you wouldn't do it. You know, the whole breach of trust and the boundaries and the fair, you know, the power differential, as you say. You should
Absolutely.
hold that.
But apparently it's uncommon wisdom. So there we are. But it's extraordinary, you know. It's extraordinary. But yes, I mean, so you know, I mean, I understand that people in, you know, environments where they have shared passions for subjects and so on may be interpersonally attracted to each other. I understand that, but I think there's a difference between that and acting upon it. And also, you know, I mean, our taught postgraduate courses are 1 year. Well, outside that, then there isn't that relationship in that way. So if people do feel quite so strongly for each other, they do have opportunities. But one of the most ludicrous arguments I came across on this one, from my perspective, was they said, "Oh, you know, you can't do this. We can't say this to staff because it'll reduce their pool of people that they could date." I know universities have got big, but proportionate to the world, they're pretty small and minuscule, aren't they?
What town they live in, yeah.
Yeah, it was almost a human rights issue. You know, how could you do this, you scoundrel? You know, so it's extraordinary in my view. Yes. Anyway, so those are my you know, that's my take on that. So, but you can see, as I say, that mix between the, you know, the higher ed sector and the forensic background, how they were brought together for me in that area. And I've written a couple of books on that, and I've broadened that to sort of more gender-based violence across the piece, because I think that it goes beyond sexual violence and sexual misconduct. And there's all sorts of aspects to that which interest me, like this sort of advent of sort of like strangulation during sex, all these sorts of things, and about, you know, how dangerous these things are and so on, and how you know, the sort of online pornography, how that influences children and so on. I mean, lots of things have changed in the world. As I say it, I feel a little bit of a prude, you know, from the past in that way. But I do, you know, I don't think I am, and I do think these are issues of concern.
No, that's a really interesting, again, sort of growing field, isn't it, about people who use strangulation then go on to kill people.
Absolutely. And of course, the violence against women and girls, the rates at which partners and former partners are killing young women are frightening. I mean,
frightening, yeah. So what else are you sort of focusing on? You're talking about some sexual crime. You've talked about the suicide in prison. Is there anything else you're focusing on at the moment? What sort of coming on the horizon?
I've got my finger in a number of pies, I'm afraid. Yes. So I'm focusing on. I'm writing an article at the moment on with a well, actually, with someone who was a PhD student I was external examiner for 10 years ago today.
Oh,
which we both discovered today, that, you know, and she's now a professor over in the States, and we're doing a joint article on dog training programs in prisons, and that's hopefully for the psychologist before long. So yes, so that's interested me, because what I try and do with my forensic psychology textbook, and I teach criminological psychology each year, and it's a specialist one, but we get about 170, 180, sometimes 200 people on it. And I try and add something and change something each year of me. So I'm doing something a bit different. So rather than doing the sort of cognitive skills stuff, sex offender treatment stuff, I say, oh, hang on a minute, how about this dog training program? And it was a joy for me, because I took one of my dogs in, a standard poodle. I've trained her as a therapy dog. So I took her in, and she went down a storm with the students, because I had to bring her in a little bit to just habituate her to the big lecture environment, because that's not necessarily what she's used to. So she came in and just laid down next to me, and it was interesting. The students had been asking me about what the difference between that cognitive skills stuff was, and cognitive behavioral therapy and so on, and doing stuff with dog training programs. And I said, one of the differences is what I call relational. And anyway, they could not see what I meant by this. But when the poodle came in, they immediately, well, a number of them went, oh. I said, there, that's relational. That's what relational is. You felt it now in your bones. That's what relational is. And it is different. There is something different about it. People don't go, oh, when they see the manual. Well, I mean, they may do, but I've never come across it.
Oh.
but,
Oh.
and that was quite interesting. I mean, a couple of students wrote up. I didn't realise they were taking quite so many pictures of the dog. What I did was I went through some of the exercises they do with the dogs in the prisons, and I just went through them with her because she's quite well trained, so she's a good demonstration dog, and I can just hand her to anyone and she's fine, So that was that was just another way of trying to keep the lecturing, trying to keep the module a bit more interesting, because I don't think there's many criminological psychology third year modules that'll be getting a standard poodle in to demonstrate the dog training programs in prisons. So I like to bring something else to the table, and the students are always very generous to me in the sense that they say that they appreciate the fact that, because I always bring in a few anecdotes from my time in prisons and stuff, and they seem to like that. But I always try to keep fresh and new and doing something a little bit different. So that's what I went for this time round. I also teach psychological practice, which is more like practitioner psychologist skills and things too. That seems to be quite popular, because I'm hoping next year it will be solely assessed by role play, but at the moment it's half assessed by role play, and that's quite different because at Durham we're very, very essay focused. So they tend to self-select on that. I mean, it's not for everyone to do that, but on the other hand, for some, they can just do really well in a role play. And I think that's, if someone was to want to go on to be a forensic psychologist or any type of psychologist, I think it's quite good if they've been through some of that. Been through some of those sort of role plays. We talk about things like solution-focused therapies, cognitive behavioral therapy, transactional analysis, and so on. Different sort of models. And then they get to apply them in a situation in the role play. So yes, I'm doing a lot. That's the sort of teaching side, and of course my colleague Tammy Walker, she came up here from Teesside some time ago. So I've been doing work with her too. We work quite closely together. I've got a number of PhD students doing all sorts of interesting things. I've got one of my PhD students, she's doing work on trust in women's prisons. I've got another PhD student doing work on self-harm in prisons. And I've got another one looking at like restraint methods in more medium secure units. It's really quite. Oh, and another looking at what the differences are in terms of mental health needs between Chinese students and home UK students. So I'm very fortunate. There's a whole, as I say, I mean, I have my fingers in so many pies, but it's such a pleasure to just be able to do that. It's one of the joys of academia. I do miss things about working in the prison service, and I do miss things about working in central London at the sort of headquarters. I do miss things about it. But at the same time, I feel quite fortunate to be able to get myself involved in a whole range of things here. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you've never dull moment.
Yeah, and also how wonderful to be a student being taught by you.
Oh, well, thank you. It's very, very kind of you to say. But I do, I do take it very seriously. I do try and do my best to make sure that the students get a good deal, because I always think now, people are getting caught up with debt and all sorts of things, which, I don't agree with. I think we should have we should have grants, and I think we should be paid for through taxation. Simple as that. That's my old school view. But given where we are, I think it's important to try and look at how we can do things differently, and yes, that's what one of the I've given an example of that, I guess earlier on. But I've always enjoyed that. I've always enjoyed the teaching. It's like some academic colleagues are far more focused on their research. That's their big thing. Research is important to me, but it's not the only show in town. I think the teaching is genuinely just as important. Yeah. And learning. I mean, I learn things from the students as well along the way, because there's so many. I mean, some people say, "Oh, well, how can that be? You've got all these years of experience, and these guys haven't." But if you think about it, if you've got a room with 200 people and they've all got 2 years experience each, that's 400 years of experience. Well, I can't quite match that. So, that little scope to learn. Yeah.
So what's ahead for you then? What's coming up for you, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure really. I mean, I'm hoping I'll stay healthy and stay okay. As because sadly, occasionally hear of colleagues who've not enjoyed good health or whatever. So I'm always grateful for that. But um, I think I just keep my antennae there and I keep open to things, and just try and live a fairly simple life, really. I mean, that's what I basically do. I just dig my garden, I walk my dogs, I train them a bit, um, and I don't think too much of the future in in that sort of way. I mean, I'm very fortunate. I like doing little consultancy tasks, and I occasionally do those. I do assessment just to keep my HCPC registration up, and just a few assessments like Cat A assessments or whatever, things like that, just to keep open. And I like occasionally going and doing talks and being an external examiner and so on. I mean, I'm open to. I'm not a closed book. Do you know what I mean? I'm always open to things. And so I try and keep that openness to be in as many ways as I can, really. Which I think it's really important, because I think over time it's quite easy to almost just crystallize one's views and just not move from that. And I think to be open, and that's one of the reasons why I quite actively strive to do different things each year. I quite actively do that because I think there's learning from that. So even though, to be honest, it was quite tricky at the time when I was Pro Vice Chancellor, Chair of that Sexual Violence Task Force, I had a bit of a rough ride at times. But I'm glad I did it, because I think I made a difference. And I guess if someone was to say to me, why do you do what you do? It's to make a difference. That's the best and simplest way I can have to put it. I want to make a difference. I want to make a difference in people's lives in a positive way. And of course, there's many ways in which one can try and do that. But that's what I strive to do, is to make a difference. That's it, really, as far as I'm concerned. And if I stop making a difference, I'll step back completely. Yeah.
It's been great having you on here. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you both.
So let's talk forensic psychology.